Let's go through a few example scripts of how you might use MilestonePSTools. So the first example is export hardware. You might be familiar with the configuration import export utility, a single command line tool for exporting information about cameras or hardware and being able to import those changes. So this script will walk through how to export the same information using the PowerShell module. So the first few lines, these are just going to check to see if the MilestonePSTools module is installed, and if it's not, install it. If it is installed, it's going to check to make sure you have the latest version. Okay, and then we'll set the management server address and the path where I want to export my CSV file, and then we'll get into the script. So import the module, first step, and then we'll connect to our management server. And then we just set up a array to store all our hardware info. And then we'll get into the meat of the for each loops here. So the first one, we're going to iterate through a list of recording servers. So we call get recording server, and we store that in the rec variable. And then we're going to pass that recording server into the get hardware command. So for each recording server, we're going to pass it into get hardware so that we can retrieve all of the hardware from all of the recording servers. And next, we're going to go ahead and grab the driver so we can get information about the driver name and the driver number. And we just pass the hardware object into the get hardware driver commandlet using the pipeline. And now we just create our row object, which is just a PowerShell object with some notes on it. And we add our members. So we add our name, so hardware.name, hardware.enabled, and so on. To get the password from the hardware, you actually need to call the get hardware password commandlet. So we pass the hardware object through the pipeline into get hardware password, and we store that. And then the MAC address is in the get hardware setting commandlet. So we're going to pass the hardware through the pipeline to get hardware setting. So we're going to get the hardware settings for that particular hardware in the loop. And we're going to grab the MAC address property and just grab the value of that property. And then that driver object we got earlier, we're going to grab the name and the number. We have the hardware ID, the GUID, the recording server name, recording server ID, and then we add that information into our array. And then finally, we just use a built-in PowerShell commandlet export CSV. So we pass all of the hardware info we gathered into export CSV. We give it our path and no type information. That'll just make the header a bit cleaner in the CSV file. And then finally we log out. So let's hit F5 and see what happens. Okay, so we got an error. Update module cannot be updated because you have to be an admin to do that. Okay, let's just skip that altogether because I know I have the latest version. Done. Here's our hardware CSV, edit, and we have our information. All right, next script, import hardware. So this script will import cameras from CSV file. So we have our new hardware.csv here with some camera names, addresses, username, password. If we know the driver ID, we can supply it here, and that will make it faster to add the cameras. And in some cases, for example, with the universal driver, you have to know the driver ID in order for it to add properly because the driver scan or the hardware scan process doesn't work on certain drivers. And then this is the path to the camera group that we want to drop the newly added cameras in. Now, the format here looks a little bit like Linux file paths, where you start with root and then you have your folders in a directory format. That's not something that's native to Milestone. It's just something that that I added in the PowerShell module to make it a little bit easier to navigate camera groups. And then we supply our recording server name where we want to drop those cameras in. Okay, and let's have a look and see how the script works. So start out by importing MilestonePSTools, and we log in. And then we use the import CSV command and just point to our CSV file. So we now have a new hardware rows object that we're going to go use for each to iterate through. So each record is one row, and we're going to grab the recording server based on the name of the recording server in that record, and same with the driver number. And then we're going to pass our recording server into the add hardware command and just supply that information from the CSV file. So record.address, record.username, and these properties are just the headers in the CSV file. So name, address, username, password. So that's how PowerShell imports the CSV and how you access the values. Okay. And assuming it's successful, the add hardware command returns the hardware object that you added. So I'm storing that in the HW property there. And then I'm going to go through the permissions and grant the my users role permission, basic read writes to that permission to that hardware. So in this case, I'm passing the new hardware into the get camera command to get all of the camera channels from the hardware that was added, and then getting the ACL or the access control, getting the permissions for the my users role for that device. And then I'm going through the permissions and setting these attributes to true. And then I'm sending the updated ACL back to the camera to set the properties. Okay, well, let's go ahead and see what happens. I think one of the cameras in the CSV file is already on this management server, if not both of them. So let's just see what it does. Okay, so we got some errors. I expected to see that. MAC address already exists on the recording server, and the rest of the errors are a result of that. So let's go ahead and remove the hardware from this recording server. Okay, so now I should have 0 hardware. Okay, well, let's run the script again. All right, so the hardware's been added. So if I do get hardware, select name, there's the 2 cameras that I added. All right, let's go to the next example, the add hardware sample. In this case, I'm adding, it's all hard coded. I'm just adding a sample universal driver camera using a public RTSP stream. So after I log in, I'm going to get my recording server based on that variable there. And then I call my add hardware. So the address, there's the public URL for this, this test RTSP stream. And I'm just telling the recording server to use the default credentials when adding the hardware. There's my, my driver ID, and I'll store the camera in the /demo camera group. And then by default, cameras are added, or hardware are added disabled. And the management client automatically enables it for you. And in this case, if you want it enabled, just supply the -enabled. switch. Okay, and then once we get it enabled, there's some configuration we need to do to get it to work, to actually pull the video stream and the audio stream. So I go ahead and grab the camera on channel 0 from that universal driver, and then I go into the stream settings for stream 0, and I set the frame rate to 25. I set the streaming mode to RTP over RTSP, and then most importantly, I set the connection URI. Now the names of these properties, you can, if you don't have the camera already added, it's probably going to be tough to know exactly what property names to use. So when you're building your scripts, you'll probably do get settings from PowerShell to find out what the settings are, and then you can write your scripts to be tailored for those cameras. Okay, and then to get the audio working, I grab the first microphone channel and do kind of the same thing, set the codec to AAC, set my connection URI and my streaming mode. And the microphones are disabled by default, so I'm just calling microphone.enabled equals true, and then .save, and then I go ahead and add my microphone to a device group, and that's it. So let me hit F5 and see what happens. Okay, so it should be added. There's my universal one-channel driver. All right, next, export thumbnails. So this is just a few examples of how to use the get snapshot commandlet, where you can get a JPEG of a live or recorded image, and you can alternatively supply height and width, basically all the properties that the SDK allows you to configure. So this is also an example of using MFA, federated architecture. So when I log in, I connect to Management Server XProtect and include child sites. And then I'm going to iterate through all of the sites. So I call get site list available. So I'm listing all of the available sites and then grabbing each one at a time. And then I pass the site into the select site command, so that that changes the configuration API over to use the site that you want to use. And so all of the commands, get hardware, get recording server, those are going to go to whatever site has been selected last. All right, and so then I grab all of the enabled hardware by calling get hardware, and then I use where-object enabled, and then I'll grab all the enabled cameras. So I'll pass all the enabled hardware into the get camera commandlet, and then only grab the cameras that are also enabled. And then I can go ahead and do my thumbnails. So I'm gonna send all of the enabled cameras into the get snapshot command, and I'm gonna get live video or a live snapshot and specify a width and height to grab a thumbnail, keep aspect ratio. Now, if the camera doesn't have the same aspect ratio as your width and height, it'll be resized accordingly. But if you want it to be exactly 320 by 240, then include the black bars. Will fill the empty areas with black pixels. You don't have to actually save the JPEGs to disk. You might just want to grab the latest image and see what the timestamp is, or see what the resolution is, to find out what your live or playback resolution is. But in this case, we'll save the JPEGs that we get back to my C demo thumbnails path. And you can use the friendly name of the camera, or you can use the GUID. I'm going to use the friendly name here. And if there's any characters that aren't file name friendly, they will be replaced with hyphens, I think. All right, so let's go to our thumbnails folder here and run the script. And now we have some snapshots. It's still running. Looks like it's done now. Okay, so there's one of our our snapshots. And you can see the file names are the friendly name of the camera and then the timestamp of the image. Okay, there's a couple more examples here, so let's go to the next one. So this would be what you'd use to get get a recorded JPEG image from some time in the past. And you can either supply, the timestamp that you supply will be assumed to be UTC unless you specify the local timestamp switch. Um, let's go ahead and hit F5 and see what the output looks like. And let's just take a look at one of the exported JPEGs here in the console. So this is the information that's supplied by the SDK. So we can see the hardware decoding status, the width and height, whether the image has been cropped. The date time property tells us the exact timestamp in UTC of the image. We have access to the raw bytes of the JPEG. And yeah, so this could be useful if you just want to verify that your recordings are the right resolution, or let's say in this next example, you want to make sure that you have images or you have recordings that go back a certain amount of time. If we call get snapshot with get begin behavior, it's going to go to the very beginning of the database for that camera. And then let's see, what else can we do here? Let's just grab the date time property. All right. And so then we get a list of the very first image available for each of the cameras. And we can see if there's anything unusual. For example, some cameras only go back to earlier today, whereas I have some cameras that go back a little bit further. All right. Let's go to the next one. Now this also has to do with recordings, but it's not going to grab a JPEG. It's a little bit lighter weight. It only asks the recording server to move the cursor for the media database to a specific point in time and tell us if it was successful. So this would be useful if, say, you know that you should have recordings in the last 12 hours, and if you don't, you want to know. So let's walk through this. We're going to get our cameras, so we just call get hardware, only grab the enabled hardware, and then we grab all the cameras from those hardware devices and only grab the enabled cameras. All right, and then we're going to for each through all of the cameras, and I'm creating a variable here called recordings exist. I'm going to pass the cameras one at a time into the test playback command and test to see whether there's any recordings from noon today or earlier. So if there's no recordings from before noon today, it should return false, and in which case it'll write a line. If there are recordings, then we shouldn't see anything in the console. So let's run. Okay, so we have a few cameras that don't have recordings going back to noon. Now, those look like the 3 cameras that we just added earlier. Now we can also check to see if there's any cameras in, say, the last hour. So if we do mode equals forward, and let's change our timestamp. So it's 4:35 now. Let's go back 1 hour, 3:35. And let's see if recordings exist for all the cameras. They do. But if we went to an impossible time, say 5:35 p.m., there's no recordings because that time hasn't come yet. Okay, and then if you also just want to know if there's any cameras that don't have any recordings, you can use the any mode, and then it doesn't matter what timestamp you supply. Test playback will return true if there's any recordings in the database at all, or false if there are none. And looks like all the cameras have recordings.